extend a very warm welcome to you, particularly in this cold, rainy time in California. It's kind of a compensation. It's an internal warmth rather than an external one, I'm sure. And say that we are very happy to have you here. It's not first appearance. Many years ago you were here and gave an excellent lecture, which is still in the memory of those who attended it. I'd like to perhaps give just a short summary of some of the major accomplishments of Professor Matson. On a personal note, perhaps I'd like to start saying that Professor Matson and I are very old friends in the 50s when we both taught at the University of California, Berkeley. And he was some sort of an older brother to me, if not mentally, so at least physically. And certainly provided a very important support system, and that's in all seriousness, which at that time a novice to California and very wet behind my ears, I needed very badly, and he certainly has done that and extended his friendship and support to me for many years, very many years, and I'm very indebted to him for that, and also particularly for his learned counsel and the writing he has done in that many books, 11 books to be sure, which I read, most of them, not all, and which have provided a tremendous, insightful addition to my limited knowledge. He's the author or editor of, as I said before, 11 books in the general field of the human sciences, ranging from history and politics to psychology and communication. His first book, Prejudice, War and the Constitution, which was published in 1954, won the Wilson Award of the American Political Science Association. Various of his works have been book club selections and have been translated into 4 languages. I may add that one of the books which I consider to be one of the very important and basic books he has written, is The Broken Image, Man, Science and Society, and I've had the to find him a German publisher for that. And it was translated. It was not easy to translate, believe me, and was translated and has been quite a success in Germany and German-speaking countries. Professor Matson is a professor of American Studies at the University of Hawaii, where he has taught since 1865, and he came there from Berkeley. So you can see how ancient he is. I just wanted to be sure that I catch your attention so that you really listen to me carefully. I have these sort of tricks which at times I use to be sure that people listen to what we have to say. Before that, he was on the faculty of the University of California, Berkeley, where he's also earned his doctorate in political science. He has lectured widely abroad, including England, Italy, Canada, the Netherlands, Japan, Taiwan, and South Korea. I'm trying to get him to Czechoslovakia, but he's a little bit reluctant about that because he says he hasn't learned Czech yet. Well, and in 1988, he delivered a series of televised lectures to a nationwide audience in Japan. Among the honors he has received is the Distinguished Humanist Service Award of the American Humanist Association. He is a past president of the Association for Humanistic Psychology and serves on the editorial boards of 3 professional journals. Now, that doesn't do him justice, but because we don't want to spend all the time in telling you about his accomplishments, the best way to find out about it is just listen to very carefully, attentively to his lecture. And I think that will do the job. Now let me just very quickly say what the title of the books, and also one which has a very direct bearing on the topic is a book which actually has come out not that recently, but relatively recently in 1983, and that's The Dehumanization of Man, which he has co-published with, co-written with Ashley Montague. And he will probably use that, plus so many other books, as the basis for his lecture today. He has written The Human Connection, also with Ashley Montague, that came out in 1979, The Idea of Man in 1976, Without, Within, Behaviorism and Humanism in 1972, Becoming and Behavior, 1967, The Human Dialogue with Ashley Montague, 1966, Voices of Crisis, also in 1966, and as I already mentioned, The Broken Man, Science and Society in 1966, and the German edition came out in 1968. Hope Deferred, Public Welfare and the Blind, with Jacobus Tenbrook, who was our chief, our boss at the department, in the Department of Speech, where we both taught. That came out in 1959, and Prejudice, War and the Constitution, which came out in 1954. They are in preparation. And the one is called The Inexhaustible Voice, Persuasion, Propaganda and Power. That's something I'm very interested, looking forward to reading it. And the other one is America, the Motion Picture, Myth, Memory, and the Movies. And some of you might be rather interested in that, because what happened last night in terms of the Oscars and the importance of the mass media industry, of course, is a very important value in American society. Entertainment is something which this society is obsessed with and has very dire consequences, I would hasten to add. This is just about all I'll be telling you about Professor Matson. The rest he'll be telling you in much better and clearer ways than I ever could. Matt, it's your place here now.
Thank you, Professor Steiner, John, and good afternoon. It's the first time since 1865 that I've faced an audience like this. So bear with me if I weaken somewhat, you know, being, what, 160 years old, apparently. But and you did get attention with that, John, and I think perhaps I did also by reminding the audience of that. All right. The object of my talk and of our discussion this afternoon is the moral implications of the Holocaust. And I wonder, as I ponder that title, whether it might not be more appropriate to retitle the talk The Immoral Implications of the Holocaust. Because in fact, as you all know, the essential meaning of that historic episode, which took place years ago, I think for you here, you might suppose that it took place long, long ago in a galaxy far away. That is to say, half a century ago in Europe, in Nazi Germany. The essential meaning of that event was the revelation of an immorality so broad in its reach and so deep in its penetration as to put in question the entire system of beliefs and values constituting the moral heritage of the Western world, the very foundation of what we had our civilization. Before the Holocaust of the 1940s, we knew, all of us, with complete serene confidence, what it meant to be civilized. It meant to behave in a civil manner, to keep a civil tongue, to ask only civil questions, did it not? Civilization, then, was the ultimate state of grace to which the evolution of human society had led us in the 20th century, risen, as the textbooks assured us, out of an abyss called savagery, and thence proceeded through an awkward age called barbarism, onward and upward to our present state of enlightenment and good manners. That was the definitive characteristic of a modern society, the essential distinction of which we were so keenly proud. That is the distinction between the civilized and the savage, between Prospero and Caliban, between the good, the bad, and the ugly. And then, at a single stroke, as it seems, in a moment of revelation, all of that was swept away. In the wake of the final solution of the Jewish problem, in the face of the ovens, of the mass graves, the medical experiments, the lampshades of human skin, the extracted dental fillings. In the face of that, all of the traditional neat distinctions blurred, did they not? They broke down and ran together in a blood-dimmed tide into the gutter. What price civilization now? For it must be remembered, must be acknowledged. We forget that the broadest and blackest episode of genocide in recorded history, the attempted mass extermination of the Jewish people in Europe, was not the mindless rampage of a savage tribe or the impulsive onslaught of a barbarian horde. From beginning to end, from the first doomed boxcar into Auschwitz to the last communal shower at Dachau, it was rationally conceived, system organized, and scientifically executed. Executed, of course, is the operative term. In short, it was civilized, this event. The Holocaust was civilized. This unspeakable act was performed by the well-spoken. This madness was imbued throughout with method. Now, if I seem to be speaking in riddles, talking in paradoxes, that is as it should be, for ours is a civilization, I believe, divided against itself. The dirty secret of the modern mind that suffers from schizophrenia, split personality. Both personalities are descended from the Enlightenment, with its devotion to reason and truth. But they have followed different paths. One of them tempers reason with compassion, and therefore seeks a moral truth. The other pursues a scientific and technical reason, objectively detached and, in the phrase so popular among us in the academy, value-free. Value-free, and is determined to follow some truth wherever it may lead, though the heavens fall. The architects of the Holocaust, the Mengeles and the Eichmanns, were of the latter persuasion. They were modern men to the core, each one of them the very model of a modern techno-bureaucrat. You can say that in the cadences of Gilbert and Sullivan. He was the very model of a modern techno-bureaucrat. The trouble with Eichmann, wrote Hannah Arendt, was precisely that so many were like him, and that the many were neither perverted nor sadistic, that they were and still are terribly and terrifyingly normal. To which Erich Fromm added this cautionary note, hence, as long as one believes that the evil man wears horns, one will never meet an evil man. The very point of Hannah Arendt's classic study of the mass exterminator, Adolf Eichmann, which was first published in 1963, was that evil in the present century has a new face, that it does not look like evil, speak like evil, or hear like evil, as we had thought we knew it. It no longer wears horns. Instead, it wears the face of banality, of everyday normality. And this normality, this ordinariness, as Arendt emphasized, these are her words, was much more terrifying than all the atrocities put together, for it implied that this new type of criminal commits crimes under circumstances that make it well nigh impossible to know or to feel that he is doing wrong. In fact, the new face of evil, blandly ordinary, commonplace, sincere, is not even a mask, is it? For no mask is needed where there is nothing to hide, no guilt or shame, no awareness of sin. Thus Richard Nixon, after the entire sordid and vicious skein of Watergate-related crimes had come unraveled, could go on television and announce to the American people, I am not a crook. And thus a young convicted murderer, when asked whether he was sorry for his deed, could respond, am I sorry? Are you nuts? Of course I'm sorry. You think I like being locked up? Let us stay with this prototype, this toxic waste product of the Holocaust in modern times just a little longer. The profile can be further fleshed out. For along with its new face, evil has also acquired a new voice. Forget Darth Vader now. Forget him. Those breathy sounds and rebels of Darth Vader, courtesy of the great actor James Earl Jones, you remember. Those belong to an older tradition of villainy, a more grandiose tradition, together with the eloquence of Milton's Lucifer and Goethe's Mephistopheles. Modern sin no longer speaks with the sibilant and seductive serpent's tongue. Instead, it talks in monotones, lifelessly, flatly, dully, without expression or apparent feeling. It may be relating atrocities, either inflicted or imagined, but it adopts the accents of a computer or of a recorded weather report. And the reason is, knowing no evil, this voice speaks no evil. All matters are equally trivial, and all events, tomorrow's weather or yesterday's murder, are equally unimportant. Even on the subject of greatest interest to this character, the voice speaks with the same dull banality. Listen to a typical conversation taken from the transcript of a psychologist's interview with a 14-year-old boy who had murdered a woman by setting her on fire in order, as it turns out, to collect a commission of $100. Question, did you have a good night's sleep? Answer, yeah. Question, in the morning, what happened then? Did you feel upset at all after you had poured gasoline on the woman and she burned to a crisp? Answer, no, she didn't burn to a crisp. Question, she didn't burn to a crisp? Answer, no, she lived a week before she died. It was just like on every other day. Did you cry afterwards? No. To tell you the truth, I had no feeling after I did it. Question, no feelings at all? Answer, no, I forgot all about it until they caught me. Testimony of that kind, of a similar kind, from the mouths of violators and vigilantes, assassins and assault riflers, could be, I think, repeated indefinitely. And in that little book that John Steiner referred to, on which I collaborated with Ashley Montague, called The Dehumanization of Man a few years ago, there is a litany of such, a rehearsal of such cases. Need more, or wish more, documentary evidence. But we can pick events right out of the news. Only last week here in California, we were made privy to the cool, bemused, it seems, conversations over police radio. You remember this? Of those uniformed thugs of the LAPD who were comparing notes on the radio on their collective behavior after they stopped a young black motorist for speeding. Speeding, mind you. Well, you remember, he was shot thereupon with a gun, stun gun, by one cop and then clubbed, stomped, and kicked more than 50 times until the skull was broken in 10 or 11 or 12 places. The accounts vary. By at least 3 others of the city's finest, while a dozen more officers of the peace looked on. And more of the highway patrol, I think. Each time we hear about it, there's some more of them in the background there, looking on. Then they went off to chat about routine matters, all in the day's work. And what would you bet? That at least one of these policemen, looking down at the beaten motorist, spoke to him softly in words something like these. Do you feel lucky today, punk? Well, do you? Go ahead. Make my day. You remember the movies those came from? One was the original Dirty Harry. One was a later sequel. A slight variation on the voice of banality that I've been calling your attention to. A variation which allows for just a touch of affect, if not of genuine feeling, is that of the technician of the killing ground who discusses his professional skills openly and proudly. Thus, G. Gordon Liddy, whom you may recall as the unrepentant mastermind of the Watergate caper and other more deadly episodes, told us in his autobiography, which was appropriately entitled Will, told us in his autobiography of the pleasures of his early training, his apprenticeship as a G-man, like this description. At the FBI Academy, he said, I enjoyed 2 kinds of training the most, firearms and defensive tactics. The latter was the lethal techniques of several martial arts. I learned how to take a gun away from anyone foolish enough to hold it close enough for me to reach it, and to tear off his trigger finger in the bargain. I learned to kill a man immediately with no more than a pencil. I learned to maim, to blind, and generally to employ my body's personal weapons against an opponent's vulnerable areas. He enjoyed this the most, he said. That is the voice of the technician, the professional expert, merely expressing a pardonable pride, as don't we all, in his special area of expertise, which happened to be assassination, along with a few related skills, such as maiming, blinding, and the like. He might have been talking about any other normal occupation involving some talent and finesse, chicken plucking, perhaps, or mortuary embalming. What he was in fact talking about, here and elsewhere, in his candid confessions, was killing, the systematic and deliberate killing of human beings, not in, you understand, but in peacetime and on command. No matter, all of life was war to Gordon Liddy, and this is how he himself explained it. I also fail to see any distinction between killing an enemy soldier in time of declared war and killing any enemy espionage agent in a Cold War, or even killing certain U.S. citizens. It is the same rationale by which I was willing to obey an order to kill Jack Anderson. That's the newspaper and TV commentator, whom you'll see for your nightly TV or read his column in the paper. Same rationale by which I was willing to obey an order to kill Jack Anderson. But I would do so only after satisfying myself. Now listen to the precision, the meticulous caution, the care, the expertise of this, the niceness of it, the mathematical precision of it, reminiscent of Captain Queeg in his search for who stole the strawberries. I would do so only after satisfying myself that it was A, an order from legitimate authority, B, a question of malum prohibitum, prohibiting evil, and C, a rational response to the problem. You can be sure it would be all three. Liddy, in short, was perfectly willing to act as judge, jury, and executioner all at once, to murder a civilian like Jack Anderson, who had been charged with no crime, but was merely disfavored, disliked by the FBI or some other secret agency. What was it that led this educated, middle-class, respectable, eminently respectable American, law degree and all that, such a state of numbness that he could feel no qualms, no doubts, no slightest hesitation in plotting and perpetrating the ultimate crime against a fellow human being? Clearly, by the way, an innocent human being. It is in the answer to that question that the strange case of Gordon Liddy takes on a special significance in connection with the Holocaust and its moral implications. I was reminded in conversation with Professor Steiner just yesterday that there's an interesting coincidence in the fact that the young John Steiner in Czechoslovakia in the 1930s found himself listening, correct me if I had this wrong, to the original little radios. You remember that little streamlined shape with the word standard on it, which was sort of like our Philco back in the 30s in America. And listening to a strange voice, a voice coming from Germany, that he could hardly make because the voice seemed to be screaming, shouting, but partly because he was very young and couldn't quite grasp all of the language. But he was chilled to the soul in hearing it. It was clearly the voice of doom. This was Adolf Hitler, of course, as he was gathering his resources and taking the country by storm. And at the same time, and this is the point of my story, I told John that's interesting because one reads in Gordon Liddy's autobiography of how, as a small boy in the 1930s in New Jersey, he too, by courtesy of a maid they had in the household, who tuned the broadcasts to these foreign wavelengths, listened to Adolf Hitler over and over again, and how Gordon Liddy, far from being chilled to the soul, was inspired to become the great man he became, to follow the cause, to be like Hitler. A few years ago, I dealt some with this case under the title in the Dehumanization of Man book, under the heading, The Mechanical Will, Gordon Liddy, because that's the key to this man's sinister behavior. Liddy makes emphatically clear to us in his memoirs that he had undertaken early in life a systematic campaign, turns out to be a lifelong campaign, to will himself into the status of a machine, literally to become a killing machine, as cold as a knife blade, as efficient as a Luger, as impersonal as a missile. Listen to his account of a boyhood stage, an early stage, in his self-training, for his future as a killer. This is when he volunteered to help a neighboring farmer slaughter his chickens in the hope that this would permit him to overcome the last vestiges of emotion that still bothered him a little whenever he killed an animal. At first, he tells us, he was a clumsy executioner. But he kept on in his steadfast way until, well, here's how he puts it. He puts it this way: I got better at it, and over a period of time, I killed and killed, getting less and less bloody, swifter and swifter, surer with my axe stroke, until finally I could kill efficiently without emotion or thought. I was satisfied. When it came my turn to go to war, I would be ready. I could kill as I could run, like a machine. Like a machine. The process of dehumanization takes a variety of forms, of course. But of them all, the one that is perhaps most characteristic of our own age, and most plainly the product of modern civilization, is the transformation of humans into machines. It's a familiar nightmare, not only of our time, of course, but of an earlier time as the Industrial Revolution was beginning to take effect, and to give people some pause about its consequences. The mechanization of society, the mechanization of industry, carried with it some implications for humanity. And at the apex of that Industrial Revolution, Mary Wollstonecraft shot a book which she subtitled A Modern Prometheus, Frankenstein, the prefabricated monster of Dr. Frankenstein. In our day, the threatening figure more often takes the form of a robot, an android, or what we used to call, I hadn't heard this phrase so much lately, a cyborg, for a cybernetic organism, sort of a collage of some once living parts and some mechanical, cyborg. Many of you will remember the Arnold Schwarzenegger version of this mechanical nemesis in a movie a few years ago, rather a good one if you go into these things, called The Terminator, in which an all but unstoppable robot killer from the future stalked the heroine through half the movie in one of the most harrowing and relentless chases ever filmed, surely. Any who remember that chase over the Bay Bridge, I think it was, and the final solution to the problem of the android, will never forget that. And a few years earlier, Yul Brynner, remember, impersonated just such an android, just such a mechanical gunfighter. He played the part of a mechanical gunfighter in Westworld, which featured an equally relentless pursuit of the human hero, as well as a veritable killing orgy on the part of robots gone haywire in an automated Disney world of the future. Lovely sight. I saw this with my small son. I don't know why I ever subjected him to that one. It looked like fun in the beginning, but turned out to be rather ferocious. And finally, just to round out for the moment our cinematic rehearsals of this modern nightmare, who can forget, who can remember, Demon Seed, the 1977 movie in which Julie Christie, the lovely Julie Christie, was somehow impregnated, the details are unclear, by a demonic supercomputer with plans not only to take over the world, but to propagate its own species indefinitely. So Julie was chosen, of course, for this, well, you couldn't call it a virgin birth, but whatever it was. And one can almost envisage the sequel, which would be something like Demon Seed meets Rosemary's Baby, I suppose. That would do it. Might even be the beginning of a successful television sitcom. While we're in the of our communal dreams, that is, the magic theater of the movies, let us linger a little longer to observe another visual incarnation of our modern dread of dehumanization, that which has made this robot, this android, this mechanical being, such a figure of fear for us. And this one has also had a long run both on the screen and in the backs of our minds, and in the dark at the top of the stairs. This is a version closely related that I think I particularly have collected. I have developed a really rather a remarkable collection of films privately. My university, probably like yours, is without budget for these matters pretty much. You know, you can't get them to buy them. I tried for a long time. So finally I said, I'll go get them myself, look for bargains, get the catalogs, you know, buy the old beta blowout things, you know, the little betas you can pick up cheap. And one way or another, I have assembled a collection that probably now is between 600 and 700 clips. They're all feature films, virtually all of them, good documented. And so I have been able to sub-specialize, and I have my collections in my little categories and so forth. This is the zombie. This is the undead. That's what I want to talk to you about for a moment. First, let us acknowledge the presence within us, or at least within some of us, as an alter ego, or doppelganger, if you will, a double. Listen to the testimony of a young man, a professional photographer with a penchant for the art of violence, in a book called Terrorist Chic that was written some years ago, his interview. He replies to a question as to his motive in pursuing sadomasochistic activities. Because it keeps me awake, he says. I'm just always in a zombie state. And it's hard for me to keep awake because I'm numbed by the TV and the magazines and everything else. Sometimes I let myself be beaten. I don't really like it, but it wakes me up out of a zombie state. The reference to oneself as a zombie, capable of being awakened only by some demonic agency or instrumentality, is especially significant for our purposes, I think. Because remember that in West Indian folklore and in the modern recycled fake lore of North American popular culture, a zombie was a human corpse, raised from the grave by a sorcerer or supernatural, and made to walk the earth like the somnambulist of Dr. Caligari's cabinet, seeking to bring to others the death that it yearned for itself. The familiar cycle of life imitating art, imitating life, is strikingly illustrated by the resurrection of the zombie in The Lost Generation. The return of the living dead, that is, to both the theater of popular film and the stage of everyday life. That the zombie has returned to the real world is demonstrated by the convergence of interest and attention on the part of social scientists, gathering numbers of social scientists, upon the study of alienated human beings in the modern urban scene, the urban jungle, often described, diagnosed in such terms as the living dead, legions of living corpses, and by Erich Fromm as necrophilous personalities. You know what necrophilia is. Love of corpses, literally. Sometimes that, too. Marvelous popular song of a few years ago by one of the punk groups, which I won't try to recall the lyrics of for you, but it has to do with dead babies and corpses in coffins and one thing or another. And so this passion for death and for corpses and for filth and for things that have to do with deadness is what is meant by the necrophilous personality in Erich Fromm's famous analysis. And he says of these personalities, they are consumed by the passion to transform that which is into something unalive. So you see how connected these images are. All that then, Fromm and these other diagnoses, is on one side, the side of social reality, of the observation of social reality by scientists. On the other side, there is the enormously successful career of the zombie, the undead, in the movies. Some of you are probably a little more familiar with this side. While this dehuman creature had plenty of forerunners in earlier films, in the form of vampires, of course, golems. You may remember the golem. Not too many here will, perhaps, because I don't think we yet have a Hollywood version of that particular nightmare. Vampires, golems, somnambulists, and assorted monsters, they were there as precursors. But the figure of the zombie as such first appeared on the screen, to my knowledge, in 1932 with Bela Lugosi's White Zombie. Interesting conception. And this is regarded by critics as one of the best of the zombie films. When one speaks, of course, of these films, this is a term that takes on different meaning from the usual sense we give to it, but at least perhaps the most frightening or the most thrilling or the most effective in some kind of emotional way. And it, of course, makes sense that Bela Lugosi, fresh from his triumph as Dracula, would have inhabited this film. Anyway, it starts with The White Zombie of 1932, and thereafter it became a B-movie staple, reaching the pinnacle of cult status in the 40s with Val Lewton's film, I Walked with a Zombie. The enduring part, how many of us can name? These titles are really marvelous, so that's why I linger on them and keep bringing them up. The enduring popularity of this Caribbean version of The Walking Corpse was reflected in a succession of spin-offs and takeoffs during that period, and later, like, for example, Zombies on Broadway. Probably that was inevitable. Zombies on Broadway. I never saw that, but it's one that I'm looking for, if any of you see it. And it provided a new word for Webster's dictionary, zombie, and it gave a name to a potent rum pump. The zombie drink, introduced during World War, you remember, during World War II? Yeah, the zombie was the forerunner of the Mai Tai and all of those other contemporary rummy siblings. The word gave way, or the popularity of this gave way temporarily in the 50s to more novel variations on the theme, notably The Invasion of the Body Snatchers, which came out in 1955. This was a sleeper, and it was a Siegel film, and it was, there were no stars in it, but those of us who saw it never forgot it. I happened to see it in Japan. It's kind of an odd coincidence. I was out there that year with a new bride, and the two of us were in a theater. It was in English. It wasn't subtitled in English. It was done in English, and there we were watching this thing, and she was so frightened that all through the movie she kept talking to herself just to try to keep from falling apart. Just some people do that in fear. Oh, she said, I don't believe that for a minute. So come down. But she was terrified. She thought that her heart was beating so loudly that it must be disturbing everyone around her. And for months afterwards, I could. And I'm afraid I did. Maybe this is why the marriage finally fell apart. But years later, if I went up behind her and went plop, 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 plop. Those of you who remember the movie, that's an in-joke. Scared her to death for months. And then this thing underwent a powerful revival, that is, of the zombie films themselves in the late 60s. Yeah, the one in the late 60s, of course, was George Romero's pioneering work called The Night of the Living Dead. And that, too, like The Invasion of the Body Snatchers in the 50s, was eminently a B film. It was a very low-budget film. But it worked, and it still works. Rent it and look at it again, and it still chills. Quaint as it is, it does. And then there was an even more ghoulish equal to that some years later, which revived the cult of the zombie, revived the zombies, you might say. And that was Romero's own Dawn of the Dead. He did one more later. The Dawn of the Dead, you'll recall, gave us the memorable spectacle, in case you missed it somehow, of a pitched battle in a suburban shopping mall between an army of zombies, real zombies, that's now newly arisen from their graves, collectively, converging on the shopping center, I guess because food is in there, and a gang of leather-jacketed bikers modeled on the Hells Angels. Collision of these two forces, these two similar forces, in pitched battle, in mortal combat, on the fields of Long's Drugs and Safeway, not on the plains of heaven. One recalls this imbroglio in a kind of a bemused way because I can remember the thing. I can't forget it. But part of what was interesting and signal about it in the connection of zombie films was that it was almost impossible to decide which side to root for. Which was more destructive? Those bikers, the way they were portrayed, or the zombies? Which was more the zombie? So, of course, there's a metaphor there. It was a parable. I don't know if Romero meant it, but nowadays he likes to claim that he always does, and that his movies have all of the deep significance that French critics find in them. The same French critics who know that America has a great comic sense because we have produced the great comedian of the 20th.
Jerry Lewis.
Who?
Jerry Lewis.
That's right, Jerry Lewis. For our purposes, the significance of the zombie is in the coincidence of its arrival as a phenomenon of culture at the same time as social pathologists were discovering the word as a metaphor to describe a new and spreading type of deviant personality, that is, a dehumanized human who has arisen not from the rural graveyard, in this case, but from the urban junkyard, the accidental waste product of the asphalt jungle, the neon wilderness, and the air-conditioned nightmare. That zombie. The discovery of the real-life zombie was not merely a case of life and social science imitating art. Rather, it was the other way around. the dramatistic image of the living and walking dead, as 50 years ago, derives its power to fascinate us, its dreadful credibility, from the frisson of recognition, the little thrill of, aha, I know that it evokes in us. Because it is not only in our nightmares that we have seen these empty faces and rigid forms before, we have seen them on the street, in broad daylight, as faces in the crowd, strangers on a train, anonymous figures in the background of the cityscape. They exist in fact. They're really out there. But in their lifelessness, their absence of affect, and their vacancy of expression, they assume an air of unreality, like mannequins or marionettes. The illusion of their being the living dead is not pure fantasy. They correspond in actuality to our deepest human intuition of their nature and their portent. Thus, for example, one sociologist who was a colleague of John's and mine years ago at Berkeley, Stanford Lyman, referring to the proliferation in our midst of, as he puts it, asocial formations of strangers, marginal men, disaffiliated persons, lonely crowds, and uprooted masses who share an attenuation of the normal human capacity for feeling. He says this of them: these people are not dead in the conventional sense, nor indeed are they very likely to kill themselves in acts of release from a dreadful ennui. However, they might form corps of living corpses, legions of zombies, who, because of their defection from living, prey upon those who have not yet fallen into the cavern of contemporary despair. Well, enough of the zombie. What we're dealing with here is what I call a pathology of mechanization, and specifically the emergence of a new kind of social character, which appears to be not so much deviant as mutant, an organic combination of man and machine. That's the point I want to make. It is this freak product of cultural evolution to which another sociologist, Louis Jablonski, some years ago, gave the name robopath. Robopathology was what he was concerned with. So this was the robopath. The creatures of a society which worships mechanical efficiency, regularity, and predictability, robopaths are individuals, writes Jablonski, whose pathology entails robot-like behavior. They are people who simulate machines. If the robopaths among us were only a few in number, or if they were only the harmless swarmers of the lonely crowd, there might be reason for some concern, but there would be little cause for alarm. But the apprehension of social scientists like Jablonski and numerous others is that their numbers are multiplying and that their pathology is taking on the proportions of an epidemic. We would do well to attend to this diagnosis and this concern, but the description of the American robopath in the present day bears an altogether ominous resemblance to the profile of the German Nazi of another day. The Nazi, that figure who was perhaps best epitomized in the apocryphal statement attributed to a Nazi. When I hear the word culture, I reach for my revolver. However, he would not need to say, when I hear the term popular culture, I reach for my revolver. What he might say is, when I hear the term popular culture, I reach for my video, or perhaps for my MTV. But anyway, we'll get to that in a moment. What is most disturbing about the behavior of our own native robopaths is not, of course, that it is automatic. That isn't the point. That isn't the whole point. But rather that it is aggressive and violence-prone. That is the point. In short, the robopaths are not just machine-like in their conduct. What else is new? Rather, they are walking engines of destruction. Jablonski says, in a society of robopaths, violence reaches monstrous proportions, wars are standard accepted practice, and conflict abounds. It's an interesting combination of phrases which we should ponder, because intended, when it was written by Jablonski, to be the scenario of a possible future, some conceivable outcome if things really go from bad to worse. It wasn't intended as a report on our present condition, but I fear it is not all that far from being an accurate description of our society in the year of our Lord 1991. Maybe not quite. Perhaps it is not yet true that wars have become standard accepted practice among us. But we're getting there, are we not? War after little war. As for the rest of the robopathic symptomatology, that is, the indices of violence and of aggression and conflict, Surely these abound among us in nearly every sector of our contemporary society and culture. Let me itemize. Our politics are beset by dirty tricks and sneaky practices, by racist campaigns. Does anyone here remember Willie Horton? And accusational cowardice. How did you vote on the use of force in the Gulf? You wimp. Okay. And by a level of public debate that I think is best epitomized by talk radio and the late Morton Downey show, which I understand is coming back. Isn't that nice? Hardly wait, can you? So much for public discourse. Our schools are more than ever blackboard jungles in which the battle lines are as tightly drawn between teachers as they are between gangs of students. Their objective, that is, of the public schools, in urban areas at least, for the most part, their objective has become not education, but containment, holding the line, holding down the noise, holding off the violence, holding back the night. They've taken on the functions of the police, while the police have taken on the functions of disciplinary teachers with whips. Our cities are characterized by all that is implied in that ominous term, the inner city. Now, if you say to somebody, well, where are you from? I'm from the inner city. You know, you tend to move to the next seat. What we are pleased to call the infrastructure of the cities has so deteriorated through neglect, indifference, and mismanagement that they are more and more of them, simply rotten at the core and crumbling at the edges. Well, I could go on. I could speak the degradation of sports. A lot of you are in sports. Who isn't into sports? I'm into sports. Very much so. I admit it. Did you read that new report on the spreading corruption of the colleges by big-time athletics just out last week? By the NCAA itself. Telling the college presidents, some of them were college presidents, one of them, ironically enough, is the president of Notre Dame, on the commission, saying we've got to take hold of this thing. We're getting to the point where, as you know, we finally will give total credibility to the famous claim of a college president a few years ago that he hoped to develop a university of which the football team could be proud. And that has to do then with the degradation of sports. In the Dehumanization of Man, I devoted an entire chapter to this, in trying to indicate that it doesn't just have to do with big-time colleges and the profession or commodification of athletics through football and basketball. It goes down the line. It goes all the way down the line to the little children in the little leagues picked out, perhaps, to be eugenically developed and bred for ultimate participation in the National Football League. And if they're really lucky, they're really fortunate, and if they really have the talent, they can make millions playing both baseball and football until the football gets them. At least that's Bo Jackson's tragedy. So I could go on with this litany of horror stories and disaster reports. I could take you on a guided tour of the suburbs, the pleasant suburbs of popular culture, where we might observe the new note of meanness, of sexism and racism among the male comedians on the Comedy Channel and elsewhere. Andrew Dice Clay, for example, Sam Kinniston, good old Sam, and the Andy brothers, of whom I myself, maybe some of you would disagree with me here. In fact, some of you probably disagree with saying anything bad even about good old Sam Kinniston, but I would include Eddie Murphy, at least Eddie Murphy Raw, in that collection of sexist, racists, and otherwise mean-spirited, fun-loving young men. And we could be, we don't have to stay home with the television. We go to the movies together and observe the astonishing presence of the new pornography of violence in our mainstream cinema. Mainstream now. Not those little theaters you went to alone, sort of looking around to see if anyone saw you down in the lower part, the inner city, not those, no, the mainstream cinema. The new obsession of the movies with sex, lies, and videotapes. Remember that one? With tying up and tying down. With provocative versions and variations of sadomasochism ranging small-town fashions of Dennis Potter and Blue Velvet. The Rossellini girl must really have shown some courage to be able to put up with that. And the big city refinements of Mickey Rourke in 9.5 weeks, of course. Most of you know that movie, should know it. Mickey Rourke, by the way, is becoming increasingly identified with that sort of role, you know. One begins to think that it's a Mickey Rourke movie. Well, we'll leave the fact. It's unfair to him, perhaps, a good actor, but maybe he'll break out. And after the movie, we could go back home again and turn on MTV just in time to see Madonna, right? And her friends, getting it on, taking it off, and generally living it up in ways which, I do believe, would have shocked the whore of Babylon. Or how about a track or two from the new hit album of Two Live Crew? Would you like that? All sweetness, civility, and these boys. Popular culture. You're right, John. There are consequences, and we have yet to pay them all. Well, anyway, another time for those things. We haven't time to go into all of that. We won't go down those garden paths and mean streets anymore this afternoon, although I would be pleased to explore them with you in discussion with whatever time we have, if you choose to bring up any of these tangents, any of these variations on the theme. But what I have sought to point out is just a few high and low lights on the continuum of dehumanization as illustrations of that dehuman syndrome which found its apotheosis, if not its apocalypse, in the death camps of Nazi Germany. And I have sought by this recitation to demonstrate that while the Totentanz, the dance of death, the danse macabre of the Holocaust is ended, the malady lingers on. Our culture may seem to be in remission, but the malignancy lurks in the blood and in the bowels. Someone said, well, some years ago, quite a few decades ago actually, that when fascism comes to America, you all know this expression, it will come in the form of anti-fascism. Well, maybe it did, maybe it did, maybe it didn't, but it certainly did come during the 1950s, for example, in the form of anti-communism, a kind of hysterical, persistent, systematic, politically astute form of anti-communism, as those of us have to remember the Grand Inquisitor of that period, the late Senator Joseph R. McCarthy of Wisconsin, can testify. John, be honest with the committee. Why don't you admit you were a member of the Young Women's League? You were there in that front group, were you not, John? Be honest with us. Ah, yes, that was the way the voice of evil sounded in those days. Incidentally, those of you who do not remember the McCarthy of the Blacklist can go out to your neighborhood theater because it's playing now. What's the movie, do you know?
Guilty by Suspicion.
Exactly, Guilty by Suspicion. Watch Robert De Niro pilloried. Some real historical characters are actually conjured up in that. There's a little bit of nerve in that film. And it's called Guilty by Suspicion, a title which reminds me of another book written by a victim of that particular Inquisition many years ago. Owen Lattimore wrote a book about his own trials called Ordeal by Slander. Very similar title. Still worth reading. Guilty by Suspicion. Well, hell, if Bobby De Niro's in it, it can't be all bad, right? But remember the words of Erich Fromm. He who expects the evil man to wear horns will not meet an evil man. There is a new face of evil, more appropriate to our times. The devil no longer wears horns, just horn-rimmed glasses. And probably carries a briefcase. And in the briefcase there are likely to be statistical printouts, technical papers, scientific data, perhaps validating the case for a new nuclear facility like 3 Mile Island out there, or for the location of a toxic waste dump on the outskirts of your town, or for novel experiments in human engineering and genetic experimentation to improve the race through eugenics. And in the process, of course, weed out the weaker stocks and the inferior ethnic strains. These are a few of the symptoms, just a few of the demonic pathology in our time. The new masks of evil, the marks of the beast. They are most typically technological, objective, impersonal, data-based, fact-oriented. Just the facts, ma'am. But we do not merely, please, look for these marks, these telltale signs, only on the face of our neighbors. It was Pogo, you all remember, that said, what? We have met the enemy, and he is. And it was Albert Camus who said, we are all victims, we are all executioners. The capacity for sin, the potential for evil is in us all. It's not just out there, down there, in that part of the city or whatever. It knows no class, no race, no gender. And that really is the point and the gist of my lecture. But it's not the end of the story. If there is a tendency in us all to goodness and inhumanity and cruelty and coldness and indifference, there's also a humane dimension, surely, as well. There is an equally deep, I think deeper, finally perhaps more abiding, more innate and more natural to us, of which I have written much more extensively than I have written about human destructiveness or dehumanization. In some of those titles that John was gracious enough to conjure up out of some dead past, because they're all out of print, you know, like moldering in their shelves somewhere in some distant library. They are books with titles like The Human Connection, which was a book about love, essentially, although non-verbal communication. The Human Dialogue, which was a book dedicated to the proposition that the natural and normal function of human discourse is to understand the other, is dialogue, not monologue. Not speeches like this, but dialogue. And so, surely, I just want to leave you with the thought that I am not simply a voice of doom. I wouldn't want people to say, I heard that man, he was the literal voice of doom up there. Apocalyptic voice. My God, he talked about sexy, terrible movies and all those sorts of things. Yes, that's an object lesson. This lesson is an object lesson. We're dealing with objects, with the objectification, the objectization, if you like, of human beings. This is the point of the kind of syndrome that I wanted to emphasize to you this afternoon. But if humanization, there is also rehumanization. There's always the possibility of that. There's always the real potentiality in all of us and in our societies, not only for redemption or forgiveness in some sense, but for rehabilitation and for new growth. It was that great philosopher, Chauncey Gardiner, in the movie Being There, who said, after the winter comes the spring. And in some sense, of course, that does remain an important truth as well. So I'd like to leave you with that more hopeful note. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Matt, for the very stimulating and thought-provoking lecture. We certainly appreciate that. It may have been above the heads of some of them, but I think just can reflect on that, and in order to perhaps clarify some of the pointers here which were made here, I think we will question and answer period, and
Good.
Professor Matt
Good.
will graciously answer whatever questions you may have.
There is
Thank
point
you.
in that, because many of these things, I decided here to deal extensively rather than intensively. Therefore, all sorts of things were explored, exposed maybe, opened up. Nothing, of course, was solved. Nothing was analyzed in depth. And so there may be some element of this that one or another of you would like to see further explored. Ma'am?
Could you talk a little bit more about things that you see between the people in Germany at the time of the rise of Nazism compared to Americans now? You have made that suggestion that we see a lot of the same points. And
Yes, it seems to me that there are several which one can address that, and it's also very clear, by the way. I don't know if you're a student of Professor Steiner, but John Steiner, of course, comes from that experience, and not only is he a trained sociologist, he's also someone with a detailed memory of unfortunately unforgettable episodes which would do more to diagnose than to illustrate the character of those Germans who stood by, or those Germans who participated, or those Germans who did not know but should have, or those Germans who knew but pretended not. At any rate, all of those who in one way or another were accessories before, during, and after the fact of this Holocaust. I can do so only, of course, from book learning. So my examples are not that original or that astute. But it may be that there's someone, not that I'm through with this, but I see there's someone there who perhaps will give us an example. No? You want to go to another? Well, hold on a second then. The point that I wanted to make in the talk was that the dehumanization of many different forms that is perhaps most significant in the context of the parallels between the German episode and the contemporary episodes of dehumanization, is that which takes its cue from the tendency which is peculiarly modern, which could not have existed in an earlier time, for the mechanization of man. And this also is something that I've written about extensively, not merely in that book, The Dehumanization, but in the Broken and more so in a book called The Idea of Man. It does seem to me that the mechanization, in some sense, the transformation of human beings into machines, into entities that are as emptied out of genuine feeling and of volition and of independence and resourcefulness as machines are, is the modern pathology. It's the typically modern case, and it stems from the worship of technology. It stems from an unequivocal endorsement of that form of rationality, which by itself is merely technical, is wholly technical. And that technical, functional rationality is the rationality that was on display, let us say, in the behavior of the Nazi doctors, who systematically, with precision and altogether rationally, and very unemotionally, they had achieved scientific objectivity. They had achieved true value neutrality. Were able to conduct experiments, because these were required by the new order. The end always the means, does it not? Always. I was ordered, I was given an order by legitimate authority, Gordon Liddy says. If legitimate authority tells me to kill Jack Anderson, I will kill him. So the Nazi doctors took their subjects apart, searched far and wide for those that would be eligible for this, that, and the other genetic experiment and the rest of it. And what a parable that is, you know. I mean, if it didn't happen, no, it shouldn't have. I can't say it should have happened. But having happened, no Franz Kafka, no ironist, no satirist has mounted a more monstrous parable for this modern pathology than this use of science. This is the extremity to which it can be carried if it is not humanized, if there is not within it that dimension, that saving grace of human sensibility. And in the pursuit of science, not least of all on the part of social scientists, not least of all on the part of psychology, one finds, for example, in the tradition of behaviorism, an assiduous search for total objectivity and value neutrality, decision to neglect, to inattend to anything that resembles an inner source of purpose or of will or of mind even in the human being. No, we'll just deal with the behavior. First we'll deal with the behavior descriptively, then we'll deal with it predictively, and then we'll control it. I don't say the behaviorists are all of this disposition. I wouldn't say that. I simply say that this disposition carries within it the seeds of that sort of contamination, the contamination of education, the contamination of culture. Yes, sir?
Well, I'm hearing that there are many potential Eichmann types in our society. Then, after hearing all of this information on these lectures and here tonight, and you stated it beautifully, what do you tell me I can start doing as a human being, knowing this information now, as many students are here? So what is the next step I might do to start to overcome that finality of evil that is masked and walking beside us? It is not beside us, it is within me. What do I do about it? First,
my answer to that it carries no originality, no particular authority, but obviously the revolution that we starts with the revolution of self. That is to say, the place to begin is with oneself. Maybe that's also the place to end, and maybe that is sufficient, because the problem with us is not only that we can take ourselves in hand, you know, and sort of talk ourselves into something, or train ourselves, or do this or that or the other, but we're all too ready to do it to others, and that's perhaps not what is called for particularly. What is particularly called for is first seeking to identify and to support, to nurture, to reinforce those tendencies within one which move in the direction, I would think at once, this may seem a paradox, of independence, sufficient independence so that one thinks for oneself before one obeys the order. One thinks for oneself before one waves the flag. One thinks for oneself before one simply puts up the hand, you know, count me in, Heil, whatever, I'll go along with that because everyone else is doing. These are the capacities for independence, for the development of some critical thought, reflective capacities on our part. But the other side, paradoxically, is interdependence. It is the capacity to care for others. It is the ability to think in terms of the welfare of others. You know, if you do that, if you think about the other that you're dealing with, it may be difficult to carry out one of Dr. Mengele's experiments on him. If you think and you care about the animal, well, we're now developing, some of you might think it ridiculous, and perhaps it is far out yet, but we're developing conceptions of animal rights. We're beginning to think that creatures are part of an endangered atmosphere that we share. And therefore, of course, one does not simply shoot them all, kill them all, or even perhaps experiment with them all, without giving it some thought. And this is the whole point. If one gives thought before these kinds of behaviors, then maybe they won't be as readily carried out. There's another thing about this notion of the capacity for reflective judgment, for the moment of reflection, for stepping back from some participation, some ongoing stream, and for just a moment, let me think about it. I'll probably go with you, but, you know, I'd like to make the decision. And that is that sometimes that's all the time that is needed. If a stampede is going on, if a herd is moving, if a riot is starting, if some kind of mob thing is happening there, and you just step back and others perhaps step back, that's all the time perhaps that is needed for cooler heads to prevail, at least for oneself to develop a cooler head and to say, I don't want to be a part of that. I care not to be a part of that. I don't think I'll sign that. Or, at the other table, well, it'd be popular, but I think I will sign that. It goes either way, of course. Well, I've over-answered that, maybe. Yes, sir.
I want to ask you about a film, and
please do. I love that.
Okay. If I understand your concept of rehumanization, I think the film I want to ask you about is probably an attempt at that. I want to know why you think that Charlie Chaplin's The Great Dictator had such a heavy social impact, such a social impact that he was deported from the United States for.
Yeah, the way you word that, it supposes that I have said that. I would put it a little differently. I do happen to think that The Great Dictator is a superb film. It is, of course, some of you may not recall, is not just about Hitler, but it is a sort of powerful, a satirical lampooning of Hitler at a time when there was still admiration for Hitler, a great deal of it in the United States. And therefore, there are those who suppose that Charlie Chaplin's deportation was entirely a matter of his portrayal of Hitler in The Great Dictator. Actually, I do believe, and I think if you read more deeply into this, you will come to agree. There's a biography of Chaplin by Robinson, which is, I think, the best, I think, the definitive work on the man, and his own autobiography isn't bad. But at any rate, the deportation had to do with two other factors. First, the long-time accusations, more by innuendo, and guilty whispers and this kind of thing, that Chaplin was, in some sense, a red. You know, early movies had encouraged revolution. This little one-reel and two-reel comedies. They had not. That he was a sympathizer with these radical causes. And he was, in some sense, a radical. He was surely a liberal, which in some generations in our society has been enough to get one deported. In any case, there's that. But there's also something more. We're talking about Charlie when we talk about the character, we're talking about Chaplin when we talk about the man. And there is Chaplin the immoralist. In the judgment of many Americans during the 30s and the 40s, Chaplin the man was behaving shockingly. He was accused and brought to court on a paternity suit. A young woman, I can almost remember her name, famous case, nearly won, you know, accused Chaplin of being the father, unacknowledged father, out of wedlock, of course. Remember, in those days, things were really more orthodox, perhaps, than they are today, of her child. That's it, something very... And she lost the case finally, and he was vindicated, but that doesn't do it, does it? Careers of public figures are often destroyed, just destroyed by innuendo and whisper. And this is, of course, what makes so very, very terrible, so fascist, if I may say, these periodicals like the National Enquirer and so on. They stop obviously at nothing. There is no scandal they would not divulge if they can possibly get away with it, and they assume that they will get away with it because you're galled to sue them back or you haven't the money, and so they pull this kind of stuff off all the time. Yes.
I was thinking about Dances with Wolves, of course, which won the Best Picture last night. It seems like that has some kind of a humanizing influence in terms of the way we treated the Indian and the somewhat bestiality of the soldiers that were moving into the West. Could you say anything about how popular culture might also reflect the humanizing influences, or the rehumanizing influences, such
Yes.
as that movie or others?
I'm glad to hear, by the way. I was in conversation with someone, I can't imagine who, last night, and it was you, Charlie, and you, and therefore missed the award, something I never do. Hopefully somebody back in Honolulu has recorded it for me, but that's still good as, you know, the moment. I would have, of course, been addicted totally for 3 hours or whatever, however long it takes. So I'm glad to hear that Dances with Wolves won, although there were other great candidates. I still have the foggiest notion who else won. Director? Costner. Okay, Wolves swept then, I take it. And
Not actors, though.
not actors. Okay, Costner didn't win that. And the supporting actor candidate from that movie did not win. So who was the best actress?
Kathy Bates.
Best actor. That's amazing. The Academy is growing up. That's the mature and responsible and interesting decision. They didn't go with power there, I guess, unless the studio had more power than I know. And the best actor was?
Jeremy Irons.
Yeah, that was more or less predictable or well predicted. It's interesting, of course, that Jeremy Irons should win because he's had a record of almost unbroken acting triumphs. He's becoming, although this is probably not the way to put it, doesn't sound right, the male Meryl Streep. He's developing a record. And actually, of course, he co-starred with her in The French Lieutenant's Woman. They scored beautifully off one another. So there may be irony in the Irons victory, but it was certainly well deserved. I would have liked to see Richard Harris win, but, you know, you can't win them all. What? Yeah. Well, anyway, I'd like to hear more, but I had a question.
Rehumanizing.
Oh, wait, I didn't answer rehumanizing. I'm sorry, yeah. We should all dance with wolves, of course, just as we should ride on the backs of whales. Though not sharks, you'd have to draw the line somewhere. I mean, you can love the shark, but you should do so at a certain distance, and that's about the only exception that I would make. Snakes are turning out to be good pets. I mean, they're all kinds of... So, in some sense, it's a book about, a film about ecology, as well as a film about the relationship of a nation and the native population. Let me say that I do not think, as some people do, that it is excessive to maintain only one Holocaust in the 20th century, and that is the anti-Jewish Holocaust, the systematic destruction, genocide, practiced against the entire Jewish population of Europe. I mean, if it had their way, all would have been exterminated. It was systematic and deliberate. But it does have a parallel, does it not? It has a precedent in American society, which we don't like to talk about. And most of us, perhaps even, there's still some denial as well as guilt involved in our acknowledgement of the historic fact. But the attempted extermination of the Indian, of the Native American, very nearly as systematic, very nearly as effective. If it failed, it wasn't for lack of will. It wasn't for lack of people out there who wanted to kill them all. The only good Indian is a dead Indian. Even when I was little, people said this seriously. I'm that old. The only good Indian's a dead Indian. Movies like this are part of a cycle that began in 1950, to my knowledge, with Broken Arrow. After the war, the Second World War, my war, the big one, the big red one, the big one, or that in its aftermath brought a spate of tolerance films and literature. None of them perhaps terribly revolutionary or profound, gentleman's agreement, things like that. But particularly this gave us an occasion to begin to look anew at the relationship of the cowboy and the Indian. And so with Broken Arrow, we began a series of films that in one way or another attempted to look sympathetically, not always with information, with truth or with wisdom, but usually with a pretty good will. At the Indian side of the equation, remember that in the 50s and the 60s, some of the great heroes found themselves willing to touch their skin a little and play the Indian. Play the Indian. We saw, because they were the hero, and they had always been the heroes, a Charles Bronson, you know, for example, or a Burt Lancaster, would play the Indian, and we would follow him through the film. We took that point of view a little bit. Sometimes it was a stand-up, but we took that point of view a little bit. And then came the counterculture. And yes, one of the good things about the counterculture, one of the truly constructive things, was that it opened all of those questions of oppression and of prejudice, which had not yet been explored. And the cinematic consequence of the youth counterculture in the 1960s, among other things, were films like Little Big Man and Soldier Blue. These are films which entirely took the role of the Indian. There's a scene in Little Big Man, and there's a comparable massacre in Soldier Blue, in which we are in the Indian camp. We're part of that community, and you remember the wonderful irony of Little, because the tribe, the Indian tribe, calls itself, remember, the human beings. Yeah, the others, of course, are not. So anyway, when the cavalry approaches from a great distance through clouds of dust and with the background music just rising, and we hear the bugles and we hear the sounds that always have been associated when we grew up, seeing these things on Saturday afternoon, with the last reel in which the cavalry rode in with that martial music and those bugles, all those John Ford movies, to rescue the people, you know, who had got the wagon in a circle, Pilgrim, and were fighting the Indians, and then the cavalry came and rescued them. Now, with deliberate irony, Arthur Penn was telling us, here they come riding in. And we were in terror of them for the first time, because we took the role. Movies can do that. More than any other medium of art, movies can get you into that identification. Therefore, there's a tremendous power for education or miseducation in films. And fortunately, that, although it hasn't, until Dances with Wolves, has not been as effective as it was in the late 60s, early 70s, still goes on. And the story now, the history of our relationship with the Indian, is revised since Errol Flynn and Ronald Reagan rode out on the Santa Fe Trail in 1940. Flynn as Custer. No, he was Jeb Stuart. Ronald Reagan was Custer. That seems appropriate to me. Anyway, yeah. Do we have time?
I have a very difficult, this is a comment more than a question, have a difficult time with the relationship between the movies you're suggesting and the Holocaust and the academic intellectualization and analytical nature between the Holocaust and your presentation from this world of theater. Understanding that media, how important media is, I just see, I think my father, who was a Holocaust victim, was all over in his grave if he heard this relationship between what happened in the Holocaust and the moral implications and the lightness of this relationship that you're talking about, media.
It is possible. What is at risk deals with a subject as sensitive and as serious, ultimately serious, as the Holocaust, by using examples of popular culture, or even by dealing in a somewhat alike way. Someone once said that the important thing in life, in terms of balance or perspective, is to learn how to take serious things lightly and light things seriously. Well, at least half of that is all right. I teach, among other things, some parts of popular culture, so I try to take light things seriously, academically. But maybe the other side still is bothersome to some people. I was not intending, of course, to parody anything, and I was not intending to suppose that movies of the sort, the zombie films, the films about robots and so forth, are somehow comparable or somehow directly related to that experience. They're indirectly related in the sense that symbols, parables, images, and myths are related. These films, particularly the films having to do with robots, deal with part of our imagination, our deepest consciousness perhaps, which fears that there is something in the society and the culture, something in our history, something in us which disposes us to this kind of inhumanity. to be turned inside out, to become machines. As we do, like Gordon Liddy, we can embark on a career of systematic killing. And that is related to the Holocaust. So I cannot apologize for the examples that I used, but perhaps I was not very clear in the purpose of using them. Yes, yes.
We've seen examples here, and we all know about the power of Hitler to move great masses of people by the power of a person. I'm personally not much more comfortable with rock stars in front of 100,000 people, or so-called peace activists in front of 100,000 people. To me, these sort of the medium is the message kind of thing. Do you have a comment on that? The dynamic that I fear, maybe not rationally, but...
Well, I hope I can make a comment on it. I might first make a remark before a comment. That's the first time that I have heard Hitler compared to a peace activist, but in the sense in which you're talking about it...
Well, when you're in Berkeley and you see these people run down the streets after the phenomenon, breaking windows and things, you know, it's easy for me to fear both sides. I'm not much more comfortable with the left than the right.
There are riots of the left and riots of the right. There are fanatics, zealots, fascists of the left and of the right. The term left fascism used to be used. Of course, there's a point at which the two become indistinguishable, a point of extremes, a point in which there is a corruption of the movement, and it becomes no longer a matter of what it calls itself. There may have been, in the days leading up to the 1917 October Revolution, let alone the earlier one, a great deal of idealism. There may have been in the first years of Lenin's, I don't know, I'm not sure of this, but I think there may have been surrounding Lenin an attempt to develop a literary and artistic culture, maybe even a humane culture. Possibly that was the case. But by the time that Stalin had already, I think, dehumanized Caucasus came along, Joseph Chigati, Stalin, and began to consolidate his rule, systematically, deliberately, step by step, eliminating rather, every possible competition, but particularly the intellectuals, particularly those who had read books like Trotsky and so forth. The thing had lost its character as any kind of meaningful socialist theory that anyone should take seriously. I do believe that. It finally erupted. There may have been, in the intellectuals in the 1920s, like those two brothers, Eric and... Huh?
Strasser.
No, well, yes, Strasser, but that's not the one I'm thinking of. But perhaps Strasser. I guess Strasser.
Otto and Gregor?
Yeah. No, those are not the ones I'm thinking of. One of them was Friedrich Junger, and the other one was Erich Junger, and they were both artists, poets, intellectuals, and playwrights thing, and they were proto-Nazis. Now, you know, you had also in the early days of fascism, you had the romantic poets like D'Annunzio. You had this kind of romance of fascism. So conceivably one might say that in theory, or at a certain humane early beginning of revolutions and of extreme movements, there is a difference to be made. The point that you're making is that at some far point, those discrepancies are no longer count. The differences are blurred, and they run together into the mob on a rampage.
Dynamic of some sort, it seems.
Yeah. Well, Eric, you know, you're in the Bay Area here practically. I guess you are sort of on the cusp of the Bay Area, aren't you? You remember that there was a intellectual longshoreman a few years ago. Yes, Eric Hoffer, who wrote a book called The True Believer. Have you read that? Well, that is a book that in some sense tries to explain this. And so who am I to do it? Also, of course, Hannah Arendt. The name would not be unknown to those of you who are students of Professor Steiner, when she was writing about totalitarianism, was making much the same kind of point. And that wonderful group of scholars, one of whom is particularly close to Professor Steiner, and that is from... No, the authoritarian personality team. Frida, no, not from Eichmann, but
Elsa Frankel-Brunswick.
Elsa Frankel-Brunswick, who along with her colleagues, Adorno and several others, wrote the book, The Authoritarian Personality, also tried to theoretically get to the problem of how there can be a convergence psychologically of these two opposite poles. Theoretically, they're opposite poles, left and right, radical and reactionary. So I'll leave it with that, but it does seem to me that indeed one needs to be careful about these kinds of distinctions. I think you might also want to be a little prudent or a little careful about supposing that there may be only madness without reason or without method in the anger or the outbreaks of alienated youth, because sometimes there is also a cause there, and it isn't always rebellion without a cause. However, I had a chapter, which one or two of you here, I think, have not been altogether happy with, had mixed feelings about, on the counterculture, which I call Greening of America, in that book, The Dehumanization of Man. You can see from that title that I felt that it did indeed go sour, went very, very sour indeed, but this does not put me, please believe me, in the camp of those who now are blaming the 60s, sort of like blaming the victim in some sense, or blaming the messenger, blaming the 60s for all that has gone wrong in our culture over the last 20 or 30 years. That is a neoconservative posture which I don't share. Do we have time?
In relation to that, why do you think we failed? Since
Failed
we
what?
failed in the counterculture to change our culture in a significant way. Since we knew we had to reintroduce the feeling function, we knew we had to increase community, we knew we had to teach our children differently, why haven't we had more of an effect?
Okay, boy, do you want to answer that? What?
Along with that is, I can understand the French element, but I don't understand how the L word has become a derogatory term.
Liberal.
Yeah.
Yeah, one cringes when one hears that word.
L word.
When I'm liberal, I reach for my revolver. Yeah.
That I have trouble.
But let's stay with the counterculture for a moment. It does seem to me first, Carol, that the counterculture did not totally fail. That is to say, it seems to me that the one legacy of the counterculture, which is extremely vital, ongoing, dynamic, and about time, is the release of new consciousness and new, in terms of gender. Feminism got a tremendous jolt from that. It didn't begin there. It didn't even begin with Friedan. It didn't even begin with de Beauvoir's Second Sex. It goes way, way back, and it runs deep in American society and culture, back at least to the 1840s, right? But it got a tremendous encouragement from that episode, and feminism never really made its mark in concrete and practical ways until the 70s. So there's that. Some of you may say, well, bad side. But anyway, surely not. And I also think that the movement for black liberation, that whole civil rights thing, was deeply encouraged. Also, there are other groups. Now, as one begins to spell out some of the ways in which the counterculture encouraged consciousness, we may find some people on one side and on another. You know, there may be some of you who are not yet comfortable with the idea of a tolerance of gays in our society. But however that may be, these were products, byproducts, constructive ones for the most part, of the counterculture. There's also something else. A generation of those who survived, not those who went under, like Jim Morrison or Janet Joplin, those who succumbed, but those who survived the counterculture, who gained some wisdom. Many of them are in the academy and teaching now. That is to say, there is, I think, a kind of academic counterculture which took place a little bit later. See, as the kids of the 60s grew into the 70s, there were various directions in which they went. Part of the answer to your question is, if you like, the betrayal of promise or the corruption of the members, because, of course, many of them, you know, went over to Wall Street and picked up the briefcase I was talking about, put on the three-piece suit, and became bankers. Jerry Rubin, for example, and marvelous irony of ironies, Ellsworth Cleaver, who now inhabits Republican conventions in Texas. What? Eldridge, excuse me. Yeah, exactly. So there are all kinds of ways in which persons themselves sort of lost their, you know, whatever it was that they were committed to or believed in, and that's part of the problem. I myself feel that what really did it in was the drugs. I'm sorry. I know that hallucinogenic ecstasy is great and all that, but I really think that that this was mistaken, that it was, the truth was to be found, you know, in that joint. Truth particularly was to be found in that sugar cube. And you were going to get to nirvana instantly. You were going to have awareness and even enlightenment overnight. And some of those gurus I will never forgive. Alan Watts, who thought that a 14-year-old American boy or girl could instantly, overnight, on a guided tour, perhaps, but through LSD, acquire the wisdom of someone who had been up the mountain in a mountain Japan for 40 or 50 years. No way, Alan. It didn't work, and it will not work. The truth is not in the bottle, you know. Most of us have found that out the hard way, but it's certainly not in these hallucinogens either. And I just think that there are all kinds of things that went awry there, but let us not forget that it gave us a lot of good and new and constructive stuff. Not least of all, by the way, I'm sorry to say, movies. Gave us some of our best movies. They gave us movies like The Graduate and Easy Rider. Yes. Wait. We've got to take someone who hasn't. Yes.
As a survivor of the counterculture of the 60s, I feel in a strange position wanting to defend pop culture, and I guess this goes back to the question over here. When you talk about pop culture in terms of symptomology or symptomatic of something, I get nervous. And I guess the reason is because of this current trend we find in the U.S. of censorship. There's a show at LA County right now that opened a few weeks ago called Degenerate Art, which is a reproduction of the show that opened in Munich in '37, in which a very similar kind of logic, I think, was employed by the Nazis in wanting to point to. You've been emphasizing the mechanization of life. Maybe you could think of futurism or modern as exactly the kinds of examples that the Nazis pointed to make their point that, in fact, was undergoing degeneration and therefore required this thing that 4 years later became the final solution. I guess the question I'm left with is I'm unclear as to what the representation of what the role of the task you see for us in terms of this pop culture, because, I mean, I would defend the gun. I mean, I think the gun is doing exactly what a good Catholic girl needs to do to point out that the choices often are between the whore and the virgin, and that's it. And I think that is a legacy of the 70s and feminism.
Yeah, well, I don't disagree with what you're saying, particularly the latter part, but when you, but the first part, which you're pointing to the way the Nazis, as indicative of the way that reactionary or fanatic or zealous groups wishing to censor, wishing to repudiate anything that is threatening, that is new, will point to popular culture, or to culture, not just to popular culture. The Nazis, of course, were pointing to movements in art, as well as in cinema, and in Germany and in Europe, cinema was an art, by the way, and was not ever regarded merely as public. But so did the anti-Nazis do this, because the most famous book about German cinema is what? From Caligari to Hitler. And it's a very good book, although it's biased and flawed in some ways. It tries to point out how the German cinema, as a matter of fact, led up to and in some sense encouraged Hitler. So you have, it's possible that the devil may quote scripture, and it's possible that all sides, liberal, radical, and conservative, may point the finger, either with pride, which is rarely the case when these people do it, or with alarm at some terrible thing that is happening. And among them, because that's surely right, I have pointed to a symptomatology with respect to evidence drawn from popular culture. I cannot apologize for that. That, by the way, is part of my career, since I teach film as a part of American culture, among other things, and connect it with thought and connect it with currents of action. And it seems to me again and again that one finds reflected, of course, opaquely and through a glass darkly, but one finds reflected in cinema, just as one finds reflected in literature, popular and otherwise, various currents of great importance and truths and enlightening kinds of things that make us aware of some stuff inside ourselves that is getting expressed in these more or less unconscious ways, these ways that we understand communally when we go to the movies, that are really intuitive but are not perhaps fully conscious. For example, there's a tendency over the last 15 or 20 years to deal with the post-apocalyptic future, particularly the immediate years, days even, after the apocalypse, after perhaps World War III, after some disaster has destroyed many, if not most of the people. Most of these films are films which show us an absolutely dreadful scene. Those of us who have some sense that New York has been going downhill steadily for the last 30 or 40 years need to see a picture like After the Fall of New York, or escape from New York, even better, and you see what happens in the fevered imagination of one filmmaker, and perhaps in our own sort of collective imagination, that New York may come to this. Or those of you who know Los Angeles, forgive me if you love Los Angeles, not too long ago, Ridley Scott made a picture called Blade Runner, which shows us a Los Angeles of just a few years down the road, not very far, and we look at it in horror, and yet with a sense of recognition. Now that's symptomatology. At least it is for someone who uses cinema as one would use the artifacts of any part of popular culture. It does seem to me that one finds the same thing being done. I don't know if sociology is your field, but one of the sociologists who was particularly great at this, skilled at this, is Irving Goffman, whom you knew well. This is that, you know, one builds a collage of evidence from the gossip columns, from the comic strips, from the sitcoms, from this and that and the other, and makes no apology for the fact that they don't fit perhaps the old method of gathering evidence. One just simply says, I think it's plausible, look at the design I've got here for you. This is a collage, you know. If it has for you the same meaning it has for me, then perhaps we need to attend to it. Yes?
Well, I'm wondering about, you have collected all of these movies and obviously watched them probably many, many times and so forth. And as a humanistic psychologist, I wonder about how you have observed yourself and the feelings that you have had, even though I know that you must intellectualize it in order to be able to use it in your works. But the effect that it has upon you as an individual, and extend that to the difference. It seems to me that in Nazi Germany, children weren't brought up dehumanized in the early, it happened when people, it was not a process, a long process, like what probably seems to be happening now, where I remember as a child being absolutely terrified by Bambi and the Wizard of Oz, because we didn't watch, there wasn't any such thing. And now, as a kindergarten teacher, I watched kids who watch the Turtles, they watch the Mad Max, the Terminator, and they are not frightened by them. They enjoy them, you know. This is a dehumanizing of somebody from this age on up. What, are we in a transition? I wonder what you say about that.
I don't know whether Professor Steiner will thoroughly agree with me, and I suspect he will, that the death camps did not spring suddenly, you know, out of some contingency, 1939 and 1941. The seeds of this thing we call the Holocaust were already latent in the society. For example, there had to be, and there was, a deep, deep heritage of hatred, not just, anti-Semitism is too weak a word, really, for what was happening there. Worse even perhaps than the Russian equivalent, you know, which called for the sort of periodic catharsis of the pogrom. Go get the Jews, you know, do something or other. I don't know about the Germans, I think it went deeper. And there's also another thing, and this is the German bourgeois culture is a little bit more bourgeois in some ways, other bourgeoisie, except maybe the Japanese, which is a little bit that way. There is this order. I mean, there is an appeal to it, a worship of it. It's in the classrooms. It starts with the schools. It's inculcated by the parents of the bourgeois children and by their authority figures, the teachers and the rest, and the soldier and the officer and all of those authority figures. And perhaps the German has had, perhaps, a nation to admire that, to follow that, to want to put on the uniform. Yes, it's the Prussian, of course. Maybe one can exempt the Bavarian and so on. German is an overall word for lots of dispositions. And don't forget, one of the reasons why I said that the Holocaust is the product of civilization, and that those who carried out the Holocaust were civilized, is because by universal agreement, before all this occurred, and perhaps before World War I, civilization had its apex, the arts, music, all of it, literature, the drama in Germany. Germany was the civilized capital of Europe. You know, I mean, this was where we had reached civilization. Well, I don't mean to put that down. I just mean to say that somehow there were flaws in that. There was a weakness there that these elements were able to capitalize on. I think that it all began in 1914 in some sense. It began in August 1914. I think Hannah Arendt was right, that something happened when the guns of August sounded and World War I began, killed forever the values of the old society, all of them, the good ones and the bad ones, the good, the bad, and the ugly alike, and that what was ushered in was a new world of continuous confusion, chaos, unsettlement, and so on. And when the Germans lost and were pilloried and condemned and sued and fined and punished for having lost that first World War, in the 1920s, those seeds germinated. That's where it happened. I don't know the details the way John does, but I think that I'm correct in that. And it can happen here. It can happen, that's the point. I don't want to linger, you see, myself, I'm not an expert on the German episode, but to try to draw the sorts of lessons from it that will make us perhaps aware of any reoccurrence, any resurgence, any growing up of seeds that are similar, of these bad seeds that grew up there. And we have them, and so I tried, in my way, to illustrate that here today. Yes, ma'am. Excuse me.
Just going back to the beginning, it made me a little beginning with semantics. I noticed when you were talking about evil is wearing the face of finality, that there was a real, the difference between sin and evil, it seems that they were using interchangeably. I wonder if you could explain the difference between the two.
I don't know that I can. That's a theological question. What I meant by the banality of evil was to appropriate the ringing phrase that Hannah Arendt introduced in her book, Eichmann in Jerusalem. On Adolf Eichmann, the mass exterminator of the camp, was a book that was controversial in many ways, but it was also stimulating and stirring for people because Hannah Arendt introduced the idea of the banality of evil. Evil wearing the ordinary, commonplace face. Because if you looked at Eichmann, if you saw Eichmann in the dock, if you just saw a clerk, you saw an accountant with his briefcase. And in some sense, what you saw was what you got. That is to say, in some sense, that was true. That's what he was. That's what she tried to tell us. That's what he was. He wasn't to be this. He was this. And that's the horror of it, she said. Banality is the worst guise, the worst mask. But the idea of the devil wearing horns, you don't see the devil, he's not going to wear horns, should simply mean that if we only know the gross examples, some of course what I've talked about has been very gross, but in our history, for example, I think most here, maybe there's some of you, but most here would agree that Joseph R. McCarthy, at the height of his power, on television, when he was going after, it seemed like every institution in American society, almost every element, one after the other, when he was bullying and bulldozing and hectoring people with that terrible voice, when he hovered and loomed over the country, and people were scurrying under beds almost to escape the fever of the Red Hunt. That's gross villainy. The devil wore horns. The whole country could see it in that instance. He had horns and a tail, and he was singing. He was clear to see. But that's not always the case. It could be that the next time around, it's a white-collar McCarthy, as somebody spoke of someone else. I won't mention any names. It could be someone who speaks softly and who doesn't bulldoze.
Could you give the source of that Fromm quote? You happen to have that handy, the last Fromm quote, which you...
And therefore, hence, if one expects the evil man to wear horns, one will never meet an evil man. I think that is in a book of his called The Heart of Man. But the one book that is most appropriate for most of you and for this kind of discussion is one of the last books that Erich Fromm wrote. This is someone that Professor Steiner knew, and there was a mutual regard between them. I don't have the personal acquaintance of it, but the book was called The Anatomy of Human Destructiveness, and it may be that it was The Anatomy of Human Destructiveness that has that phrase. I could get it. I quoted it in Dehuman Man, though I'm not positive, as a little, one of those little head notes at the top of the chapter, and I think it was chapter 1 or the introduction of the book, and it might have been identified in terms of its source there. But yes, it would be worth your while to find out where his analysis exists. All of his life, of course, Fromm, as one of the principal neo-Freudians, if not the most important of them, nowadays feminists at least, would consider Karen Horney to be at least as important, and perhaps more so in her impact finally. But this was an extraordinarily a powerful figure, and he was always a bit marginal to that Frankfurt school from which he came, and to other movements, and even to neo-Freudianism. He carved out his own domain. He was extremely humanistic. He was powerfully committed, I think, to those doctrines which were to become the axioms, or at least the precepts, of humanistic psychology. he was one of those who inspired Abe Maslow to form first the journal and then the Association for Humanistic Psychology. And for whatever it's worth today, or whatever is left of it, because humanistic psychology is probably stronger in this institution than anywhere else that I know, I think Floyd should be one of the champions. Yes, ma'am, we have time. You think?
Yeah, I have a question. How can we, in a relatively peaceful, to us, peaceful world here in this country, how can we deal with the increasing creeping up of evil around us that we see month to month get larger and larger? There are many examples. One of them that comes to my mind is the homelessness, for instance. At first we were shocked, and we see it grow and grow and grow, and individually we are powerless to do something against it, and we grow used to it. And how do we deal with situations like that, where we see blatant injustices, and yet the system is so large that we, as individuals, may be similar to the way it was for the Germany, cannot deal with?
Yes, pardon me. I can only respond to that personally with a sort of advisory note or a cautionary note. The L word, the dread L word. Since I am a liberal, an unreconstructed, old-fashioned New Deal liberal of that persuasion, I think I know how you deal with the homeless problem. Unfortunately, this country is not currently, and not likely for the next 6 years, to be of a disposition to do the work that was begun in the 30s, picked up again in the 1960s under the inspiration of Kennedy, and with, at first, the very powerful encouragement of Lyndon Johnson. That is, to conduct a war against that kind of thing. Of course, some of you will say, let's just throw money after it. Well, there's a sense in which, yes, this costs. If you're going to do something about the homeless, you probably don't count entirely on the church. You probably don't count entirely on the charity of the community. The federal government gets into the act. I'm sorry, but that's the liberal response to that.
I know,
yes.
But what should be done? I mean, how do we deal with it, that it is not being done, and that we live, and
how do you deal with...
we have to give up ourselves and give everything we have to one other person, or we survive ourselves, and by that we become guilty? That was my question. I think what the government should do. That was my real question. It was more a philosophical one.
But yeah, you're looking into yourself and finding out what kind of role you can play, and whether that role turns into some kind of complicity, and so on and so on. Yeah, I'm not absolutely clear about your question, but sure, not blaming the victim, so you're not suggesting that the evil is the homeless. The evil is the condition in which we find that multitude growing. And out of that homelessness comes alienation, and comes a dehumanization. So we need to deal with the problem in terms of mass psychology, as well as dealing with the problem as a political and economic and social problem. And so each one of us, I suppose, chooses what obligation one can undertake for oneself. I think this is a suggestion that our time is... Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your interesting presentation and your patience with all the